In the autumn of 1886, in the high ranch country outside Harlan's Crossing, Montana, people watched a man do something that made no sense at all. He was building an outhouse, not a cabin, not a root cellar, not a smokehouse or a proper barn. An outhouse, a privy, the least romantic structure a man could put his name to on the frontier. And yet, he was building it the way other men built courthouses. Double-walled, banked with earth on three sides, piped, actually piped, with a slow-running water line lagged in straw rope and cedar bark. He dug the pit 6 feet deeper than anyone in the county had ever dug. He poured sand and gravel beneath the pipe run for drainage. He set a small cast iron door vent into the floor with the deliberateness of a man who had thought about nothing else for a year. His neighbors watched all this from the road, and they laughed. They laughed the way men laugh at something that frightens them a little, the kind of laugh that has a nervous edge to it. Because what Elias Vane was doing was not just strange, it was stubborn. It was the stubborn act of a man who had decided the world was wrong about something and had resolved to prove it, alone, with a shovel and a few hundred board feet of pine, and a water line no one in the valley believed would survive December. The laughter started in early September, and it did not stop. By October, Elias Vane's outhouse had a name. They called it the Palace, not as a compliment. Now, before the story goes any further, you should know something. You should know that the winter coming for Harlan's Crossing in January of 1887 was not an ordinary winter. The blizzard that would arrive in that valley was the kind of cold that does not just freeze a water pipe. It freezes the memory of warmth. It freezes the idea of warmth. It kills men who thought they had prepared. And it kills livestock that had no say in the matter at all. And when that storm finally came down from the north, when the thermometer outside the Harlan's Crossing General Store dropped to negative 38 degrees and the pipes of every single ranch in the valley froze solid and cracked and left families hauling snow to melt over wood fires just to have water enough to drink, Elias Vane had running water. Running water. In January. In Montana. In a winter that would be talked about for the next 50 years. And the people who had called his outhouse the palace, the people who had laughed at him from the road all that autumn, those people came to him. They came quietly, and they came in the dark, and they came one by one. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. If you want to understand how a man builds the only working water system in a frozen county, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what Elias Vane knew that no one else in Harlan's Crossing knew. You have to understand where he learned it and why he believed it with the kind of quiet certainty that does not need an audience. If you want to know whether what he built could really work and whether the people who mocked him ever found the grace to admit they were wrong, then stay with this story to the end. Subscribe now, if you haven't already, because the answer to what happened inside that valley in January of 1887 is something you will not want to miss. Elias Vane was not the kind of man people remembered easily. He was 41 years old in the autumn of 1886, with the kind of face that wins scours into something harder than it started. He had come to Harlan's Crossing 3 years before from eastern Idaho, trailing a wagon with 2 mules and a brown dog named Scout. He had bought 40 acres of bottom ground at the edge of the valley for $220, and he had gone to work on it without ceremony. No speech, no introduction. He filed his claim, shook 2 hands, and spent the first week digging rather than building, which was, to the other ranchers in the valley, its own kind of strangeness. Men in that country built up. Elias Vane dug down. His cabin was low-roofed and banked on the north, with a sod berm that came up 4 feet against the wall. He trenched his waterline 18 inches below the frost line before he drove his first nail. He stacked his firewood in a U-shape around the north and west faces of the cabin, not in a neat pile by the door where any sensible man would put it. He did everything slightly wrong, by the standards of the valley. Slightly too deep, slightly too wrapped, slightly too concerned with the underside of things. People noticed. Hattie Greer noticed first. Hattie ran the dry goods counter at the Harlan's Crossing Mercantile and had lived in the valley her whole life, which meant she had opinions about how things were properly done. She told her husband Lloyd that the new man on the bottom ground was building like a man who had been cold before in a way that had scared him badly. Lloyd Greer laughed at that. But Hattie was not entirely wrong. The one who coined the nickname was a man named Cord Pemberton. Cord was a big, easy, laughing man who ran the largest spread in the valley, 700 acres up on the bench, and who had the particular confidence of someone who had never yet been seriously wrong about anything. He rode past Elias Vane's property on a Saturday in mid-September, the day Elias was framing up the second wall of his privy, building a full 6 inches inside the first wall and leaving that cavity between them open and empty. And Cord Pemberton pulled his horse up and stared for a long moment. "That your outhouse?" he called. Elias looked up. "It will be." "You building her double?" "I am." Cord Pemberton looked at the structure, looked at the water pipe laid in its lagged trench, looked at the shovel work and the lumber and the particular deliberateness of a man who had been thinking about this for a very long time. He turned back to the road. "Heard of a man building a palace for his horse," Cord said. "Never heard of one building a palace for his." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. By the following week, every man in Harlan's Crossing had heard about the palace on Vane's bottom ground. By the week after that, people were riding past on purpose just to see it. Some of them called out observations. Some of them simply slowed and shook their heads. A few of them climbed down from their wagons and walked over to look at the double wall, the 6-inch cavity, the careful framing, the cedar bark lagged pipe. And they walked back to their wagons without saying anything, which was somehow worse than laughing. Elias Vane did not respond to any of it. He did not explain himself, did not defend the build, did not look up from his work when men called out from the road. Scout, his brown dog, sometimes lifted his head at the sound of passing horses, but Elias never did. He worked through September and into October, slow and methodical, and he spoke about the palace only once, to a boy named Cale Marsh, who wandered onto the property one afternoon and asked, with the complete sincerity that only a 12-year-old can manage, why the outhouse had 2 walls. Elias considered the question for a moment. "Cold hunts walls," he said. "Give it something else to find first." Cale Marsh did not know what to do with that answer, so he went home and told his father, who told Cord Pemberton, who laughed and said it was the most expensive excuse for a privy he had ever heard in his life. Nobody understood it yet. Nobody except Elias. The reason Elias Vane understood it went back 15 years, to a winter he had spent in the Bitterroot Valley working for a man named August Prell. August Prell was not a famous man. He was not wealthy. He had no particular standing in the community beyond the grudging respect that people pay to someone who has been right about cold weather more times than anyone can comfortably count. He was a stonemason by trade and a builder by instinct. And he had come to the Bitterroot from Germany as a young man, carrying in his head a set of ideas about construction that had been refined over centuries in a part of the world where winter was not a visitor, but a permanent resident. August Prell did not build fast. He built right. Elias had gone to work for him at the age of 26, hauling stone and mixing mortar and doing the kind of foundational labor that nobody notices until the building has been standing for 30 years and everything around it has fallen down. He stayed for 2 winters. And August Prell, who was not a talkative man, talked to him about cold. He talked about how cold moved, how it hunted the path of least resistance, how it followed air, not material, that it was moving air that stripped heat from a surface, not cold stone or cold wood itself. Still air, Prell said, was the single most powerful insulating material a man could put between himself and a Montana January. Not wool, not wood, not stone, still air. Trapped, unmoving, dead, he used to say it like a prayer, the old mason did. He had a way of making it sound like something he'd heard from someone older than himself, which perhaps he had. Cold ain't the thing killing men, August Prell used to say. Moving air is. He said it to Elias on a morning in February when the temperature outside had dropped to -20, and the two of them stood inside a double-walled stone outbuilding Prell had constructed the previous summer, warm enough that steam rose off their coffee. He gestured at the walls, 2 courses of stone with a 4-inch gap between them. The gap packed with nothing at all, just the still air of the cavity, and he said it again. Cold ain't the thing killing men. Moving air is. Elias Vane heard that sentence and filed it somewhere deep, the way young men file things they do not yet fully understand, but somehow know they will need. He thought about it for 15 years, through other jobs and other winters, through a life that gave him grief enough to understand why a man might need a warm building more than anything else in the world. His wife, Clara, had died in the winter of 1882. She had died in a cabin with a single-walled privy that froze solid in December and stayed frozen until March. She had died, in part, because the cold of that winter was relentless and everywhere, and there was no room in their living situation that was not fighting it constantly and losing slowly. The cabin had survived. The livestock had survived. Clara had not. A fever that started in January and ran until it had nothing left to burn. Elias had thought about August Prell's words all through that winter, all through Clara's fever, and after it. Cold ain't the thing killing men. Moving air is. He knew, by the time he arrived in Harlan's Crossing, exactly what he was going to build. He had been designing it in his head for 4 years. The double-walled privy was not the eccentricity of a grieving man gone slightly strange. It was the conclusion of 4 years of careful, private thought. It was a deliberate act. The palace was built on purpose. Not everyone who doubted it was a fool about it. The most serious objection came from a man named Rupert Slade. Rupert was the most experienced builder in the valley. He had put up more than 30 structures in Harlan's Crossing and the surrounding country over 12 years, and not one of them had failed. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a petty one. When he rode out to Elias Vane's property in the first week of October to look at the double-wall construction, he came with specific concerns, not mockery. He stood inside the outer framing and looked at the 6-inch cavity, and he thought about it carefully before he spoke. Mice, he said. Elias nodded. He had thought about mice. That cavity is a highway, Rupert said. Mice get in there. They nest, they chew your lagging off the pipe. You'll have a rodent highway running straight to your waterline. It was a fair point. Elias showed him the wire mesh he had stapled across every gap at the foundation level, a measure that added 2 days of work but sealed the cavity base completely. Rupert looked at the mesh. He was not satisfied yet. Condensation, he said. That air in the cavity isn't going to stay still. Not perfectly still. You'll get moisture moving in there, winter and summer both, and you'll rot that inner wall from the outside in. In 5 years, you won't know it's happening. In 10 years, the whole thing collapses. That was also fair. It was the objection Elias had spent the most time on. He pointed to the cedar boards he'd used for the inner wall. Cedar, not pine, specifically for its resistance to moisture and rot, and the small ventilation gap he'd left at the top of the cavity. A half-inch slot under the eave that allowed any moisture that did accumulate to escape upward without creating a draft. Rupert Slade looked at all of this for a long time. "You've thought it through," he said finally. It was not quite an endorsement. It was what a careful man says when he can no longer find the flaw, but cannot quite bring himself to say there isn't one. "I have," Elias said. Rupert rode back to town. He told Lloyd Greer that he thought the man on the bottom ground was probably not crazy, that he might, in fact, know something. He said it quietly, and without much conviction, because he still thought the double wall was more than was necessary, and the waterline was audacious to the point of arrogance, and he was not yet prepared to revise the entire framework of what he knew about building in cold country, based on the work of a man who'd been in the valley 3 years. He was not wrong to be cautious, but he would remember, later, that he had seen it and had not understood it. That was the part that would stay with him longest. By the last week of August, Elias Vane had already begun. He started with the pit, 6 feet deep, 3 feet wider on each side than any privy pit he had ever seen dug in the valley. The extra width was not for comfort. It was for drainage. He laid 6 inches of gravel at the bottom, then 4 inches of coarse sand, then another 2 of fine sand, creating a filtration layer that would keep the pit functional through the freeze cycles without cracking or heaving. He hauled that gravel in a wagon from the creek bed a 1/4 mile away, load by load, 6 loads over 3 days. His back was sore by the 3rd day. He did not stop. By the 1st of September, he had the framing up for the outer wall, 2 by 6 pine studs on 16-inch centers, well braced at the corners, a roof pitch steep enough to shed snow without accumulation. Standard construction. So far, nothing the men on the road could object to. Then, he began the inner wall. He set his inner studs 6 inches inside the outer ones, running them on their own sill plate, bracing them independently so the 2 walls were structurally separate, connected only at the roof plate and nowhere else. 6 inches of air between them. Not insulation, not sawdust or cattail batting or horsehair or any of the materials men use to fill wall cavities in that country. Just air. Still, dead, trapped air in a sealed column running the full 8 feet from floor to eave. That was the thing no one on the road could make sense of. Every man in Harlan's Crossing who had ever spent a winter there knew the value of insulation. They knew you filled the walls. You stuffed them with whatever you had: sawdust, straw, old newspapers, wool scraps. You filled every gap. An empty wall was a cold wall. That was not a theory. That was 40 years of shared experience in that valley. And it was real. And the men who believed it were not fools. What they did not know, what August Prell had known and had given to Elias Vane on a cold February morning, was that an empty wall is only a cold wall if the air inside it can move. If you seal the cavity, if you stop the air from cycling, from cold air falling and warm air rising, and the whole column turning over and carrying heat away, then you don't have an empty wall. You have a dead air wall. And dead air does not conduct heat. Dead air does not carry anything. Dead air simply sits there, a column of thermal nothing, a gap that cold cannot cross. The men on the road saw empty walls and thought waste. Elias saw sealed cavities and thought armor. He did not explain this. He worked. The inner wall went up in 4 days. Cedar boards, tongue and groove, fitted tight at every joint. He went over every seam twice with a thin bead of pine pitch, heating it in a can over a small fire and running it into the joints with a stick. The smell of it sharp and clean in the autumn air. Scout lay in the grass nearby and watched him with the patient attention dogs give to work they do not understand but approve of. Then came the pipe. The water line was the most audacious part of the build and the part that generated the most comment from the road. Elias had hand-dug a trench from the spring box on the north edge of his property, a trench 2 feet deep, running 62 feet to the rear wall of the privy. Into that trench, he laid a 2-inch bore wooden pipe, the sections joined with lead-sweated iron couplings, the whole run wrapped first in straw rope and then in cedar bark, bound with wire at 1-foot intervals. He then packed the trench with 8 inches of dry sawdust before backfilling with earth, an additional thermal buffer around the already lagged pipe. The pipe did not carry pressurized water. It carried gravity-fed water from the spring box, which sat 4 feet higher than the pipe outlet inside the privy. Slow, constant, just enough to keep a trickle moving through the line at all times, because a trickle in motion is harder to freeze than standing water. The flow came through a small stone-lined basin inside the privy and drained through a secondary line, also lagged into a lower corner of the pit. Running water. In a privy. In Montana. The valley had not seen anything like it. Hattie Greer said it was the most unnecessary thing she had ever watched a man build. Lloyd Greer said the pipe would freeze by November and crack by Christmas, and the whole business would be a lesson in vanity. Cord Pemberton said, and this was the thing that made the men laugh the hardest, that Elias Vane had spent more on his palace than most men spent on their sleeping quarters, and that when January came, the only difference between him and everyone else in the valley would be that his folly had cost more. Elias heard none of this, or he heard all of it, and it changed nothing. He kept working. By the 1st of October, the structure was roofed and sealed. He banked the north and west exterior with a 3-foot berm of packed earth, compacting it in layers with the back of his shovel, the way Prell had taught him, not dumped against the wall but built up in courses. Tamped solid, graded away from the structure on top to shed rain and snowmelt. The berm rose 4 feet up the north face and 3.5 feet up the west, leaving the south face and the door exposed to the winter sun, which in Montana does not provide much warmth, but provides some, and some is not nothing. He hung the door on the south face with a double layer of canvas behind it, a draft curtain that hung 2 inches above the floor and a foot above the door's top edge, blocking the wind that would otherwise knife in every time the door opened and closed. He was nearly done. Scout approved. Scout had been sleeping at the base of the outhouse's south wall every afternoon, in the thin wedge of sunlight that the low autumn sun cast down that face, curled up with the satisfied weight of a dog that had found the warmest spot in a cold yard. He did this without being placed there. He did it because he was a dog, and dogs know where the warmth is. Elias watched Scout do this and felt something close to peace. Then came the failure. It happened on an evening in mid-October, when the first real cold came down from the north. Not the killing cold, not yet, but the testing cold, the kind that probes a structure to find what it's made of. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees overnight. Elias went out in the morning to check the pipe flow. Nothing. The line had frozen. Not at the pipe itself. The lagging and the depth had held there. The freeze was at the outlet fitting, inside the privy, where the pipe came through the wall. The iron coupling at the wall penetration had conducted cold inward through the wall itself, a phenomenon Elias had anticipated in theory, but had underestimated in practice. The iron was a thermal bridge, a cold road running right through the wall he had so carefully sealed, and it had frozen the last 4 inches of the line solid. He stood in the privy for a long time, looking at the outlet. He did not swear. He did not kick anything. He put his hand on the frozen fitting, and he thought. Then he understood it. The iron was the problem. Iron conducts cold the way copper conducts electricity, eagerly, efficiently, without discrimination. He had insulated the pipe from the earth. He had insulated the wall from the air. But he had run an iron coupling through a cedar board and left it there naked, and cold had found it in a single night. He pulled the fitting in one afternoon's work, reaming out the wall penetration to twice its original diameter, inserting the wooden pipe section directly through an oversized hole packed around with a compressed sleeve of dry cattail batting, fiber, not metal, touching the wall at the penetration point. Then he boxed the outlet inside the privy with a small cedar enclosure, 4 sides, and a hinged lid, not heated, but enclosed, trapping a pocket of air around the vulnerable end of the line. He rebuilt it stronger. He tested it the next cold night, 8 degrees this time, and stood in the privy in the dark, listening. The trickle came through. He put his palm under the outlet and felt the water, cold but liquid, running across his hand and draining into the basin. He stood there for a long moment with cold water running over his palm in the dark of a Montana October night. And he thought about August Brell, and he thought about Clara, and he thought about dead air and moving air, and the difference between the two. Cold ain't the thing killing men, he said softly. Moving air is. Scout was sitting at his feet, looking up at him with the particular attentiveness of a dog who knows his person is feeling something large. Elias scratched behind Scout's ears and went back inside. By November, the valley had stopped laughing quite so loudly. Not because anyone had revised their opinion of the palace. They hadn't. But November in that country has a way of quieting people. November is the month when the jokes about winter die, and the preparation for winter becomes serious, and the men of Harlan's Crossing were good men and serious ones. And they had their own work to do, and their own pipes to worry about, and their own firewood to lay in. The mocking went from a sport to a memory. Gord Pemberton had said his piece. Rupert Slade had made his inspection. The valley had given its verdict. Now, winter was preparing to give its own. By the 1st of November, Scout had changed his behavior. He stopped sleeping in his usual spot inside the cabin, near the stove, where he had slept every evening since his first winter with Elias. He began instead to circle the property at dusk, a slow circuit of the fence line and the outbuildings and the banked earth of the privy, sniffing things that were not there yet, attending to something the air was carrying that no human nose could detect. He pressed close to Elias in the evenings. He did not settle easily. Elias watched the dog and said nothing. A man named Jonas Wheat, the oldest farmer in the valley, 73 years old and still working his 80 acres with a deliberateness that came from having outlived 2 bad winters already, came through the valley on a Tuesday in early November, making his rounds as he always did before the deep cold. He stopped at Elias Vane's fence and looked at the sky for a long time. Then he looked at the landscape. Then he looked at Elias. Birds left 3 weeks early, Jonas said. Elias waited. Creek froze a month ahead of where I'd expect. Ground's reading wrong. Jonas shook his head. Not with drama, but with the flat certainty of a man reporting what the instrument said. What's coming is not going to be like what's been coming. It's going to be different. He rode on without elaboration. Elias stood in his yard and felt it then, what Jonas Wheat had named. The air in the valley that afternoon was not cold, not in a way you could measure on a thermometer. It was something else. Still in a way that air in the valley was not usually still. A held stillness. The held breath of something very large preparing to move. Scout sat beside him, not moving, not looking at anything in particular. Just sitting. The wind had gone dead. The kind of dead still that old-timers in that country called the waiting. The pause before. The moment when a winter that has been building its forces somewhere up in the northern ranges stops gathering and starts moving, and the valley below knows it in the air even before the temperature drops a single degree. Elias went inside and checked his firewood. He had 4 cords stacked. He had laid in those 4 cords by the 1st of October, cutting and splitting from August on. 4 cords for a cabin his size was considered adequate for a normal winter. He had thought, when he stacked it, that it might not be enough. He thought so now, with more conviction. He was right. The storm came down on the 14th of January. It did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way a verdict arrives, without apology, without negotiation, without any interest in what the people below had prepared or believed or built. It came from the northwest at dusk, and by midnight, it was a different world. The temperature at the Harlan's Crossing General Store thermometer read -11 at 10 o'clock, -22 at midnight, -30 1 by 2 in the morning. It was still falling. The wind was running at 35 miles an hour from the northwest, and the snow it carried was not the kind of snow that falls. It was the kind that drives, horizontal, like gravel thrown against glass. The kind of snow that finds every gap, every crack, every place where human construction had been optimistic. The kind of snow that finds everything you left to chance. They would call it the Black Wind Winter. That was the name it would carry for the 50 years that people in that valley talked about 1887. The Black Wind Winter, -38 degrees at its worst. 6 feet of driven snow in 3 days. Stock losses across the territory that would not be fully counted until spring. Men who knew the country well and had lived in it long and prepared for it carefully. Those men suffered, and some of them lost what they could not afford to lose. Nature had arrived, and nature never negotiated its verdicts. Elias Vane was up at midnight, feeding the cabin stove. He knew it was going to be the kind of cold that ate firewood. He had always known. He fed the stove carefully, not frantically, not with the wasteful generosity of panic, but with the measured deliberateness of a man who knows how long the supply must last. Small splits on top of a good base, the damper set to hold heat without starving the burn. He moved through the dark cabin with a lantern, and Scout stayed close, pressing against his leg with the bodily concern that dogs show when they have decided their person needs company. Then, at 2 in the morning, Elias went out. He had to go out. Not from need. Not at 2 in the morning in a January blizzard. He went out because the pipe needed to be checked, and because the checking of a pipe in a storm that bad was not something that could wait until morning. If the line failed in the night, and the trickle stopped, and the outlet froze, by morning the freeze would have progressed back up the pipe too far to recover. He needed to know. He opened the cabin door, and the storm hit him like a wall. The wind was a physical force. Not cold. He didn't have time to process cold. Force. It leaned on him, pushed him sideways on the porch, made the lantern he was carrying useless in the horizontal snow. He put his head down, and he went. 60 feet. 60 feet across his yard from the cabin door to the privy door, a path he had walked every day for 3 months and knew without thinking. 60 feet in a whiteout blizzard at 2 in the morning, negative 31 degrees, wind chill below anything a thermometer could usefully describe. He lost the path, not in the dramatic way men lose things in storms and stories, not stumbling into the dark and falling. He simply stepped 2 feet to the left of his usual line, and the fence post he expected his hand to find was not there. He stood in the snow for a long moment, lantern utterly useless, the world nothing but white and black, and the noise of the wind, which was not a howl and not a roar, but something lower, a sustained note of enormous, indifferent force. He stood still. He thought. He had laid out his yard with intention. He knew where the fence ran. He turned 30 degrees to his left and walked 4 steps, and his hand found the fence wire. And he followed it to the corner post and turned along the second run and counted steps and turned again, and his hand found the privy door. He went in. He pulled the door shut against the wind. Silence, relative silence. The storm outside was still audible as a low, enormous presence. But inside the palace, it was just sound, not force. The air was still. He held the lantern up and looked at the outlet fitting. Water was running. Slow, a trickle, but running. He put his bare palm under it and felt the water cross his hand. Cold, but liquid, moving, alive. 41 degrees outside by the nearest thermometer, the outlet line, inside its cedar enclosure, inside its dead air wall, inside its banked earth shell. 61 degrees in the air around the fitting. He stood in the palace in the middle of the black wind winter with water running over his palm. Then he heard it. A low sound from the vent in the floor. Not wind, but the ghost of wind. The pressure differential pulling air down through the pipe from somewhere outside, and the pipe giving a faint, high note, almost musical. The vent was icing. Not frozen, not yet, but collecting ice at its throat. The freezing water vapor condensing on the cold metal of the vent cap outside, building inward. If it sealed, the pit gases would have nowhere to go. More urgently, if it sealed, the pressure differential would reverse and drive cold air backward through the system. Elias had a short length of smooth wire looped on a nail beside the vent. He had put it there in October for exactly this reason. And he had thought himself fussy for doing it. He took the wire down, ran it up through the vent pipe 3 times, breaking the ice ring loose each time, working by feel in the lantern light. 3 passes. The note from the pipe changed, opened up, deeper, easier. The blockage was gone. He hung the wire back on its nail. He stood in the palace for 5 more minutes, just listening, just watching the trickle. Then he opened the door and went back out into the storm, found the fence wire in the whiteout, followed it to the corner, counted his steps, and found the cabin door. Scout met him at the threshold. Elias's hands were white from cold. He held them over the stove and waited for feeling to come back. And when it did it, came his pain. And he accepted the pain as the price of knowledge. He had paid it. The pipe was running. The building was breathing. He fed the stove once more and went back to bed. On the third morning after the storm arrived, it broke. Not immediately to warmth. It would be 2 more weeks before the temperatures climbed above zero for the first time. But the wind died, and the snow stopped, and the sky cracked open to the kind of fierce, brilliant blue that Montana sometimes offers after it has punished you sufficiently. Everything in the valley was still and white and enormous and silent. The damage announced itself by mid-morning. Court Pemberton lost his east stock tank, frozen solid through the bottom, cracked and heaved. The Greer place lost water completely. Lloyd Greer's pipe had frozen somewhere under the barn foundation and was unreachable until thaw. The Marsh boys' family had been hauling snow to melt for 3 days already, the wood stove going full-time just to produce drinking water. Rupert Slade's main water line to the house was cracked in 2 places, and when he cut into the second crack, he found the inner bore still had ice in it. He would have no running water until April. 14 properties in the valley had lost water by January 18th. 14 out of 17. That morning, Elias Vane went out to check the privy in the early light. The temperature was -24. The sky was the color of pale fire. Scout walked with him, trotting a little, the particular trot of a dog that is cold but happy, the cold making him alert, the companionship making the cold worth it. Elias opened the privy door, looked at the outlet. Running, he took his thermometer from his coat pocket, a proper glass one, not a dial gauge, and held it near the outlet fitting. He waited. He read it. 61 degrees. 61 degrees in a corner of a structure that had been sitting in -24 for 3 days, with nothing heating it. No fire, no stove, nothing but dead air and banked earth and cedar boards. He stood with the thermometer for a long moment. Then he heard something through the still morning air. A sound. Not an animal sound, and not a wind sound. A human sound. Someone on the road. He put the thermometer away and came out of the palace into the cold light. Rupert Slade was the first to come. Not Court Pemberton, not Hattie Greer, or Lloyd Greer. Rupert Slade, the man who had looked at the double wall in October and said only, "You've thought it through." Rupert came up the fence line in the early afternoon, on foot, because his horse was conserving warmth in the barn, and he knocked on the cabin door. Elias opened it. Rupert stood in the cold looking at him. He was a big man, and he filled the doorway, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and is about to set it down. "My line is gone," Rupert said. "Both places. Can't get to them till spring." Elias looked at him. "I need to know if your line is running." Elias stepped aside. He did not speak. He gestured toward the door, toward the yard, and Rupert came in and set his hat on the table and followed Elias out to the palace without another word. Rupert stood in the privy, and Elias put his bare hand under the outlet, and the water ran across it. Rupert watched. His face did not change, but something happened in his eyes, the recalibration that happens when a man's understanding of the world shifts without warning. Rupert took out his own thermometer. He held it near the fitting. He waited. He read it. 61. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the wall. He pressed his bare palm flat against the cedar interior surface of the inner wall, and The cedar was cool, but not cold. Not the metal-biting cold of a normal January wall, but the gentle cool of a sealed room that has been sheltered from a storm it never fully felt. He pressed his palm there for a long time. "I was wrong," he said. 2 words. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize at length or explain his reasoning or describe what he would have done differently. He said the 2 words, and they were enough, and Elias accepted them with a nod that was not triumph, and not generosity, and not exactly either. "You can bring your family here," Elias said, "until your line is repaired." Rupert looked at him. "I mean it," Elias said. Rupert left and came back an hour later with his wife and his youngest child, a girl of 9 who carried a bundle of blankets and looked at the palace with the open, uncomplicated interest of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by what she does not understand. The knock on the door that night came at 8 o'clock. Then again at 9:30. Then twice more before midnight. Court Pemberton came last. He came at 11 at night, and he knocked quietly. Not the way a man knocks when he has something to say, but the way a man knocks when he has lost the words. He stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, and his breath making clouds in the dark cold, and he looked past Elias at the warm interior of the cabin, at the other people sitting by the stove. "I called it the palace," he said. "You did," Elias said. Cord looked at him. "I was wrong about that too." Elias let him in. He let all of them in. He fed the stove through the night, and he did not say a word to any of them about what he had built or why he had built it or what they had said about it in the autumn. Scout moved among them all with the easy grace of a dog who did not know about pride or mockery and therefore held nothing against anyone. He settled finally at the feet of the 9-year-old girl, who fell asleep with a hand on his side, rising and falling with his breath. Elias sat in his chair by the stove and listened to the wind outside, diminished now, prowling, looking for another way in. It did not find one. By the following autumn, 4 properties in the valley had double-wall outbuildings. By the autumn of 1889, 11 did. Rupert Slade built the first one, on his own property, in the summer after the Black Wind winter. He built it the way Elias Vane had built his, double-cedar walls, 6-inch cavity, sealed at the base, and vented at the top, banked on the north and west with a packed earth berm. He showed others how he built it. He explained the principle carefully, the way Elias had never bothered to explain it publicly. The dead air, the thermal bridge at the pipe penetration, the cedar enclosure around the outlet fitting. He explained it without claiming the knowledge as his own. He called the method the Vane Wall. It traveled the way useful things travel in communities that have been humbled by a winter, not as a triumph and not as a vindication, but as a tool, a thing that worked. A piece of knowledge that had been tested by a judge that did not negotiate its verdicts and had been found correct. It moved from property to property the way a good technique moves, without drama, without the original argument attached to it. Men built the Vane Wall, and some of them had forgotten entirely that they had once laughed at the man who invented it. Some of them remembered. Those men built the Vane Wall in silence, without comment, which was their way of acknowledging what could not comfortably be spoken. Elias Vane did not attend to any of this. He kept his cattle, worked his 40 acres, maintained his pipe and his wall with the regular attention of a man who knows that preparation is not an event, but a practice. He repitched the seams every spring. He packed the berm higher every fall. He checked the vent wire before every cold stretch, not because he feared failure now, but because that was what careful attention looked like. And careful attention was the whole lesson. Scout grew old, as dogs do. He slept more. He still chose the south wall of the palace on winter afternoons, in whatever wedge of sun the January sky offered, and he still knew before anyone else when the air was changing, lifting his head from his paws and reading something the air carried that humans could not detect. A dog does not flatter a wall. He sleeps where the warmth is, because he knows where the warmth is, and no one has taught him to be embarrassed by what he knows. Cold ain't the thing killing men. Moving air is. That was August Prell's sentence, and it had been Elias Vane's conviction for 20 years. Tested once in the hardest way a conviction can be tested, and found true. Not probably true. Not true under the right conditions. True in a negative 38-degree blizzard in January in Montana. True when 14 out of 17 properties in the valley had no running water and the palace on Vane's bottom ground had a trickle running across a bare palm in 61-degree air. The strongest protection is not always the one that looks strongest. The thing that seems like overkill in September is sometimes just right in January. The wall that looks empty is sometimes the one that holds. Now, before the story ends, there is a question worth sitting with. If you had ridden past that fence in September of 1886 and you had seen a man building a double-walled privy with a lagged water pipe and a banked earth berm and a dead air cavity sealed with pine pitch, and you had known nothing about dead air or thermal bridges or August Prell's sentence, would you have laughed? Or would you have climbed down from your wagon and asked the man what he knew?